The auction house employee found it in a warehouse in Burbank, Lot 447, marked MGM Props 1930-1940, miscellaneous. It was July 2016, and they were cataloging items for an estate sale of old studio materials. Among the dusty furniture and faded costumes was a full-length mirror with an ornate gold frame, the kind you'd see in a starlet's dressing room. Nothing special, until someone wiped away the grime and saw the engraving on the back. "To baby, so you'll never forget which one is real. MB." The initials meant nothing to the cataloger, but when a Hollywood historian examined it weeks later, she went pale. MB could only be one person, Marion Becker, Jean Harlow's stand-in from 1933 to 1937. The woman who looked so much like Jean that even studio executives occasionally confused them. But Marion Becker didn't exist in any official MGM records. No contracts, no payment stubs, no photographs. It was as if she'd been deliberately erased. When the historian tried to research further, she discovered something chilling. Hospital records from Good Samaritan showed two blonde women admitted on June 6, 1937. One was Jean Harlow, the other's name had been redacted, marked only as J.H. Associate Confidential. Jean Harlow's career was built on illusion, but no illusion was more carefully guarded than Marion Becker. In an era before sophisticated special effects, studios used doubles and stand-ins constantly, for lighting tests, dangerous stunts, distant shots, but Marion wasn't just a stand-in, she was a doppelganger. Born Marion Becker in Minnesota, she arrived in Los Angeles in 1932 with the same dream as thousands of other young women, to become a star. What she had that others didn't was an uncanny resemblance to Jean Harlow, same height, same build, and after the right bleaching and styling, the same platinum blonde hair that photographed like liquid light. MGM discovered Marion when she appeared as an extra in a crowd scene. A casting director noticed her and immediately brought her to the attention of production chief Irving Thalberg. Within a week, Marion had a contract, not as an actress, but as something the studio called a photographic consultant. The contract was unusual. She was paid generously, but forbidden from appearing in any film credits, from giving interviews, from being photographed in public as herself. Marion's job was to be Jean Harlow, when Jean Harlow couldn't or wouldn't. She stood in for lighting tests that could take hours, wore costumes for fitting sessions, and performed in long shots where facial features weren't visible. But according to whispered accounts from MGM crew members who spoke decades later, Marion's role went far beyond standard stand-in work. She became Jean's shadow life. When Jean was too exhausted or medicated to attend a publicity event, Marion would appear in heavy makeup and strategic lighting, waving to crowds from a distance. When Jean's personal life became too scandalous, Marion would be photographed in wholesome settings at church, with children, doing charity work, and the images would be released as Jean Harlow off-duty. The studio was creating two Jean Harlows, the real woman who was increasingly struggling with the demands of stardom, and the perfect version who never faltered, never aged, never disappointed. Marion's contract, discovered by researchers in 2018 in a private collection of Hollywood memorabilia, is one of the strangest documents in film history. Beyond the standard clauses about compensation and working hours, it contains provisions that read more like a psychological experiment than an employment agreement. Marion agreed to style her hair identically to Jean's at all times. She agreed to study Jean's mannerisms, voice, and gestures until she could replicate them perfectly. She agreed to maintain the same weight as Jean, fluctuating no more than 2 pounds in either direction. And most disturbingly, she agreed to make herself available for any professional purpose deemed necessary by MGM Studios, including but not limited to photographic representation, public appearances, and personal consultations. That final clause, personal consultations, is where the story becomes darker. According to an alternative theory that is circulated among Hollywood historians, Marion wasn't just Jean's professional double. She was also used as a psychological tool to control Jean herself. A former MGM employee, speaking anonymously in a 1995 documentary, claimed that when Jean became difficult, when she complained about working conditions, refused certain roles, or threatened to break her contract, the studio would arrange for her to encounter Marion. Sometimes it was orchestrated to seem accidental. They'd both be scheduled for the same makeup session, or they'd pass each other in a hallway. Other times it was more deliberate. Jean would be shown footage of Marion performing scenes that Jean had refused to do, demonstrating that the studio could replace her seamlessly. It was psychological warfare. the former employee alleged. They were showing Jean that she wasn't irreplaceable, that there was literally another version of her waiting in the wings. And the cruelty was that Marion looked so much like her that it was like confronting your own ghost. In 2019, Marion Becker's niece came forward with a collection of diaries her aunt had kept from 1933 to 1937. The entries paint a portrait of a woman trapped in an impossible situation, grateful for the steady income, but increasingly disturbed by what she was being asked to do. An entry from March 1934 reads, "They had me pose for photographs today in Jean's dressing room, wearing her costumes, sitting at her vanity. Mr. Thalberg said they needed backup images in case Jean became unavailable. I asked what that meant. He didn't answer, just said I should be ready to step in at any moment. I looked at myself in her mirror and barely recognized my own face. I've become her so completely that I'm not sure where she ends and I begin." By 1935, the entries grow more disturbed. "John and I met today, really met, face to face, for the first time. The studio usually keeps us separated, but there was a scheduling error. We stood there staring at each other like we were looking in a mirror. She said, 'They're trying to make me disappear, aren't they? They're replacing me piece by piece until there's nothing left that's actually me.' I didn't know what to say, because she was right." The most chilling entry is from April 1936. "I was called to the studio doctor's office today. They took blood samples, measured every part of my body, photographed me from every angle. When I asked why, the doctor said they were creating a comprehensive medical profile for continuity purposes. Later, a nurse I know told me they're building a file comparing my health to Jean's. She said, 'They're tracking which one of you will last longer.'" Here's where documented history blurs into speculation, and speculation darkens into something that might explain Jean Harlow's mysterious death. An alternative theory that emerged from analysis of Marion's diaries suggests that by 1937, MGM was preparing to implement what some researchers have called the ultimate replacement. Jean was dying. Her kidney failure was obvious to anyone paying attention, the bloating, the fatigue, the cognitive decline, but she was still under contract, still obligated to complete Saratoga. The studio had invested heavily in the production and needed it finished. According to this unverified theory, MGM developed a contingency plan. If Jean died before completing the film, they would use Marion to finish it. Not just as a stand-in for distant shots, they'd already been doing that, but for close-ups and dialogue scenes, using careful cinematography and editing to disguise the substitution. The theory sounds absurd until you remember that MGM did exactly this. When Jean died on June 7, 1937, with several scenes still unfilmed, the studio used doubles and creative camera angles to complete Saratoga. The official story says they used multiple stand-ins and body doubles, but several crew members later claimed there was one primary double who bore an uncanny resemblance to Jean, someone who knew her mannerisms so well that she could replicate them perfectly. That double was never publicly identified or credited. Marion Becker's name appears nowhere in the production records, but a cinematographer who worked on Saratoga mentioned in his unpublished memoir that there was a woman on set whom everyone called the other one. He wrote, "She was there almost every day of shooting, standing just out of frame, watching. After Jean died, she stepped into Jean's place as if she'd been rehearsing for that moment her entire career." Which, I suppose, she had been. Let's return to those hospital admission records from Good Samaritan Hospital, June 6, 1937. Jean Harlow was admitted in critical condition with kidney failure. But the notation about a second patient, J.H. Associate Confidential, raises disturbing questions. A researcher who gained access to the hospital's archives in 2007 found something even more unsettling. The two patients were assigned rooms on the same floor, separated by only 3 doors. The J.H. Associate was admitted the same day as Jean, treated by some of the same medical staff, and according to fragmentary notes, was being monitored for compatibility assessment. Compatibility for what? The records don't specify, but one notation, made by a nurse and later crossed out, reads, "Standby protocol active, awaiting instruction from external party." The alternative theory suggests that Marion was brought to the hospital as a backup plan. If Jean could be stabilized, she would complete Saratoga herself. If she couldn't, Marion would be ready to step in, and the public would be told that Jean had recovered just enough to finish the film before succumbing to her illness. It's a grotesque scenario, one that positions Marion as a living insurance policy. But it's consistent with how MGM operated. Every problem required a solution. Every risk required mitigation, and human beings were just resources to be allocated as efficiently as possible. Here's where the story becomes genuinely eerie. After Jean died on June 7, 1937, Marion Becker vanished from all records. Her MGM contract was terminated, but there's no final payment documentation, no exit interview, no forwarding address. She simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. For decades, researchers assumed Marion had either died or changed her identity and disappeared into obscurity. But in 2019, when her niece came forward with the diaries, she revealed that Marion had lived until 1981, dying at age 72 in a nursing home in Oregon. She'd never married, never had children, never spoke publicly about her years as Jean Harlow's double. She'd worked as a department store clerk, a librarian, a seamstress, ordinary jobs under her real name, Marion Becker, quietly living an unremarkable life. But according to her niece, Marion never stopped looking like Jean Harlow. She kept her hair platinum blonde until it turned white. She maintained the same elegant posture, the same careful grooming. Even in her 70s, strangers would occasionally tell her she resembled that old movie star. Marion's response was always the same. "People say that, I don't see it myself." The niece said Marion never watched her own reflection for very long. She told me once that mirrors made her uncomfortable. She said when you spend years looking at yourself and seeing someone else, you start to wonder which version is real. She said, "I was Jean Harlow more than Jean Harlow got to be. I performed her life better than she did, and I'll never know if that was a gift or a curse." Let's return to that mirror found in the MGM warehouse in 2016, the one with the inscription, "To baby, so you'll never forget which one is real. MB." But there's another interpretation. What if the mirror was a gift from Marion to herself? What if baby was Marion's own nickname for herself, a private identity separate from Marion Becker, Jean Harlow's double? In that reading, the inscription becomes a desperate attempt at self-preservation, a reminder to Marion herself that she was real, that she existed independently of Jean, that she wasn't just a reflection. The mirror now belongs to a private collector who purchased it at auction for $18,000. The collector has reported something unsettling. Sometimes, in certain lighting conditions, when you look into the mirror, there appears to be a faint double image, as if two reflections are superimposed, slightly out of sync. It's probably just a quirk of the old glass, a manufacturing defect or damage from decades in storage. Probably, but it's a fitting metaphor for this entire story. Two women, two reflections, two versions of the same life, never quite aligning, never quite separating. Marion's last diary entry about Jean was written on June 8, 1937, the day after Jean's death. The entire entry reads, "She's gone. The real one is gone. And I'm still here, still looking like her, still trapped in this face that was never mine. They asked me to come to the studio today to discuss final work on Saratoga. I know what they want. They want me to finish being her. They want me to step into the frame one last time and pretend I'm Jean Harlow completing her final performance." I said no. For the first time since I signed that contract, I said no. Mr. Mayer threatened to sue me, to ruin me, to make sure I never work again. I told him I don't care. I told him Jean Harlow died yesterday, and I'm not going to desecrate her memory by pretending she didn't. He looked at me like I was insane. He said, "You've been pretending to be her for 4 years. Why stop now?" I said, "Because she was real, and I was the pretense. And now that she's gone, I need to remember how to be real myself." I don't know if he understood. I don't know if anyone could understand except Jean, and she's not here to ask. I'm going to leave Hollywood. I'm going to let my hair grow out to its natural color. I'm going to find work where nobody knows who I look like. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to remember who Marion Becker was before she became Jean Harlow's shadow. And if I'm very lucky, maybe someday when I look in a mirror, I'll recognize myself. The story of Jean Harlow and Marion Becker is ultimately a story about identity and an industry built on illusion. Jean became a star by transforming herself from Harleyan carpenter into Jean Harlow, bleaching her hair, changing her name, adopting a persona. Marion tried to become a star by transforming herself into Jean Harlow, studying her, copying her, becoming her. But while Jean struggled to maintain some core of authentic self beneath the platinum goddess image, Marion had to actively erase herself. Her job was to disappear into someone else so completely that the seams didn't show. She succeeded so well that she was erased from history. No credits, no recognition, no acknowledgement that she existed at all. The cruel irony is that Marion probably knew Jean Harlow better than anyone. She studied every gesture, every expression, every vocal inflection. She inhabited Jean's image more consistently than Jean herself could, because Marion wasn't burdened by Jean's actual personality, emotions, or physical limitations. Marion could be the perfect Jean Harlow because she wasn't Jean Harlow at all. And Jean, confronted with this perfect copy of herself, had to grapple with a unique kind of existential horror, the knowledge that she was replaceable, not just professionally, but ontologically. The studio didn't need her to be herself. They just needed someone who could look like her and perform the role convincingly. Marion's existence was proof that Jean Harlow the person was less valuable than Jean Harlow the image. So much about this story remains uncertain. Was Marion really at the hospital when Jean died? Did MGM seriously consider having Marion complete Saratoga as Jean, or is that speculation built on fragmentary evidence? Did Jean and Marion have a relationship beyond those few documented encounters, or were they kept deliberately separated? We know Marion existed. The diaries, the contract, the mirror, all confirm that. We know she looked remarkably like Jean and worked for MGM in some capacity. We know she disappeared from records after Jean's death and lived quietly for another 44 years. What we don't know is how much of her life was consumed by being Jean Harlow's double, and what psychological toll that took. We don't know if Jean saw Marion as a threat, a colleague, or a disturbing mirror of her own commodification. We don't know if MGM's use of Marion was simply practical Hollywood efficiency or something more sinister, a deliberate attempt to psychologically control Jean by confronting her with a living replacement. The mirror with its enigmatic inscription suggests some connection between the two women, some moment of recognition or solidarity. But we'll never know if that connection was genuine or if it was just another performance in an industry where nothing was ever quite real. Today, when we look at Jean Harlow's films, we're watching a woman who knew she was being slowly replaced by her own image, by the studio's manufactured version of her, and by a literal double who could perform her identity more consistently than she could. And somewhere in those films, in shots we can no longer definitively identify, we might be watching Marion Becker instead. Standing in for Jean during a lighting test that made it into the final cut, performing a gesture Jean had refused. Living a moment of Jean's cinematic life because Jean was too exhausted, too medicated, or too human to deliver what the studio demanded. The line between Jean and Marion, between the original and the copy, between the person and the performance, has been blurred beyond recovery, which is exactly what MGM wanted. A Jean Harlow who could be deployed infinitely, whose image could be controlled completely, who would never die because she was never fully alive to begin with. Jean Harlow died at 26. Marion Becker lived to 72, carrying the weight of a face that was never quite hers and a name she was forbidden to claim. In the end, which woman paid the higher price for Hollywood's illusions? When you look in a mirror and see yourself, how do you know it's really you looking back? And if someone else has been practicing your reflection for years, studying every angle until they can replicate you perfectly, does that make them more you than you are? Jean gave Marion a mirror, or Marion gave it to herself, with an inscription reminding someone to never forget which one is real. But 87 years later, watching those films, we can't always tell. The copy has been integrated into the original so seamlessly that they've become inseparable. Maybe that's the real horror of Hollywood's golden age. Not that it destroyed people, but that it made it impossible to distinguish between the person and the performance, between the woman who lived and the image that survived her. Two women, one face, two reflections that never quite aligned. And somewhere in the gap between them, the truth about who Jean Harlow really was and who she might have been if she'd been allowed to be real.